letter of John begins with these words: "We declare to you what was from the beginning, what we have heard, what we have seen with our eyes, what we have looked at and touched with our hands, concerning the word of life." 13 years ago, like most churches, we had a stream of people knocking on our door looking for food. Sometimes we were able to help folk, but often we couldn't. And after a while, we grew uncomfortable and weary of having to say no to hungry people. So we decided to start a soup kitchen. And at first there was some reluctance in our church community. Some people said, "There's no money in the budget, who's going to pay for this?" Our church had once had a soup kitchen before, but it got shut down because the crowd that was coming had become unruly and even threatened violence at one point. Some were worried about the noise that people would make when they came for their food, and that the noise would interrupt the Bible study and worship. But we were undeterred. We felt deeply about this. And even though soup kitchens are just a band-aid on a much bigger and more complex issue, we really felt like we couldn't keep saying no to hungry people. It became this holy discontent in us. So firstly, we reminded those who were worried about the noise that we had other buildings on our church property, and that would create space for them to escape the noise of the soup kitchen. And I also, perhaps a little unkindly, mentioned to the folk that our worship and prayer are pretty empty if it is at the expense of hungry people. Secondly, we undertook not to ask for any money from our church budget, that we'd simply invite members of our congregation who wanted to supply soup and bread to do so. And that we argued that for as long as there was a constant supply of soup and bread, we would keep offering it to hungry people. And let me tell you, nearly 13 years later, that supply has not ceased. It's a wonderful thing. And then, just as some arbitrary standard of control, I promised, kind of as the benchmark, I said that if anyone ever got stabbed while attending our soup kitchen, that's when I would shut it down. That was the kind of the arbitrary measure of violence that we would use. At first, while the numbers were still relatively small, we actually never had any difficulties. So we never put any proper crowd control measures in place. But then, as the numbers grew, the group once more predictably became unruly as people clamored for food. I remember on a few occasions coming to the soup kitchen like a sergeant major and threatening to take away their food if they didn't get themselves in order. And just for the record, I didn't look or sound like Jesus at all in moments like that. And then one day, emerging out of the group of people gathered for soup, a young man approached Sharon and asked if he could help keep the crowd in order. So Sharon, reasoning that there was nothing to lose, accepted his offer. And then, with what surprised those who were around, with startling efficiency and with immediate effect, the group listened to this young man's instructions. We were later to discover that he had a reputation for violence, that he had in fact done a stint in jail for violent crime, and the crowd who had gathered at the soup kitchen knew his reputation. And so when he said jump, his jump was met with a resounding how high. That young man's name was Shane. And this little offer of help and its effectiveness began a relationship between Sharon and Shane, a very unlikely relationship which would grow and deepen over more than a decade. And through his relationship with Sharon, Shane decided at one point to start attending our church for a little while. And we used to have this informal evening service, which included sitting around, drinking coffee, having something to eat, and then having a guided conversation together. And that environment, I think, was ordinary enough to make Shane feel safe. Plus, of course, there was free coffee and food. And Grant Butler, a leader in our church and a regular speaker at that evening service, also then began a relationship with Shane over coffee in our church foyer. Shane lived mostly on the streets. And in Sharon and in Grant, he knew he had found a good thing. He knew he had found people who would help him out if he needed it. People who would give him the time of day, people who would listen to him. But the story of Shane is more than a story just about a street person begging for bread. Grant, in his relationship with Shane, refused to give him something every time he asked. Because Grant didn't want a relationship with Shane that was just about handouts. He wanted to try and lift the relationship to something more equal, not just the powerful versus the needy, but instead to create a relationship of two people, one of whom sometimes might need the help of the other. For Sharon, on the other hand, the relationship began to take on something of a motherly role. Shane became her somewhat delinquent child over whom she watched with care. She would provide for him, she would reprimand him when he needed it, she would guide him, she would teach him, she would seek to help him. And in a wonderful twist in the midst of their relationship, this kind of gangster, violent guy, when Sharon told him to jump, he would say, "How high?" And although Shane never entirely abandoned his life of crime, his violent streak softened. And Shane regarded his violence as a part of his troubled youth. But I really like to think, and I really do believe, that perhaps the softening of his heart began when he had found at least two people who managed to let him know in some way that he was a person of great value, that he was a person with rich personality and character, that he was a person who really had all the potential to make a contribution to society. I think Shane was a leader. But above all of that, I think through his relationship with Grant and Sharon in different ways, Shane discovered that he was a person who was genuinely loved. Quite recently, while Sharon was chatting to Shane, one of the other street people started getting stroppy around them, interfering with them. And so Shane turned to him and said, "Keep quiet, I'm talking to my mother." And the other guy said, "She's not your mother." And Shane said, "This is my mother." When John wrote his letters, one of the popular heresies of the day was called Docetism. It comes from Latin and Greek words, which means "it seems to." And this heresy argued that Jesus didn't actually come in the flesh, it just seemed like he did. Because there have always been people who thought that this material world in which we live and these bodies of ours, that they are sinful, and that our flesh is in fact at war with our spirit, it's against it. So the argument was that if you wanted to really be a spiritual person, you'd have to learn to ignore the physical and material world and just focus on the spiritual world. And coming out of that thinking, Docetism argued that therefore, if that was true, Jesus could never have come and taken on this dirty physical body in which we live. So therefore, if we saw him, he must have just seemed like he was here. Because the argument was that only that which is spirit can be pure and good, and the physical is evil and sinful. So then we pay attention to what John writes in his opening sentence. He says, "We declare to you what was from the beginning, what we have heard, what we have seen with our eyes, what we have looked at and touched with our hands concerning the word of life," Jesus. So John is challenging, in fact, I want to use the word, John is attacking this idea of a disembodied Jesus. Idea of Jesus who never came in the flesh. Because John knew that a disembodied Jesus would give birth to a disembodied church, would give birth to a disembodied faith, would give birth to believers who practiced a disembodied discipleship. A disembodied church will be a church which loves to pray, but not to protest against evil. It will be a church which loves to worship, but not to work for justice and for peace. A disembodied church will be a church which loves to study the Bible, and yet is unwilling to take all sin seriously, not just the juicy bits. I think we as a church are obsessed with sex, but we like to ignore sins that involve money and greed and power and violence and unkindness and gossip. We like to study the Bible, but we don't want to take all sin seriously. And John knew that a disembodied church would be a church which loves to break the body of Christ at communion, and yet which ends up being so disrespectful towards the bodies of others. Can I ask you just to think about that? I'm not going to get into it now, but just think about that. A church which loves to break the body of Christ at communion, and yet which is disrespectful towards the bodies of others. The resurrected Jesus, whom we still celebrate today, the one who was heard, seen, looked at, and touched, gave birth to a living community of people, not just so that they could gather in holy huddles, but that as a community of faith with one heart and one soul, to live and to bring life into this physical, material world. And they would do that often, most often, just one life at a time. Last weekend, Shane was killed when he was hit by a car at a busy intersection in our city. And so today, I know there are many people in need, but today I want to ask that we remember especially all the people who live on our streets. Many of them are trapped in cycles of poverty, substance abuse, and crime. And most of them are simply looking for someone who will hear them, who will see them, who will look at them, and who will touch them with love.
Sharon and I had a relationship where we tried to see each other once a month, tried to anchor and just try and find out what was going on in his life. And over the years, obviously there were some months we didn't connect, but generally this was the rule. One of my favorite stories about Shane is many years ago, he found a stray dog running in Newton Park, and he brought it into the church property, sort of dragging it by the scruff of its neck. And I was highly upset, and I said, you need to take your belt off and put that around the dog as a lead so that I can get hold of animal welfare and the dog is contained. And shame, he took his belt off and put it around the dog, and then had to hold his pants up with his other hand because he couldn't he needed his belt desperately to keep his pants up, but he did forego his belt for the dog. And yeah, and Sharon was just a sweet soul, a lost sweet soul, and I'm going to miss him terribly. Sharon and I had a special relationship in that he accepted me for exactly who I was. I wasn't someone that I don't think that he ever considered to be above him. And yeah, we just really, we hit it off from the day he offered to help me. And we've stayed connected over all these years. And if he's been in need, I've obviously done my best to try and see to that need, even if it's been a handout. I was happy to hand out to Shane. My wish would have been to try and get him off the streets. But I realized that in his nature, this is the only thing he knew. So in fact, it would have been me imposing what I thought was good for Shane on him, which in fact would never have worked. And yeah, I'm going to miss his presence. I'm going to miss our chats, our regular chats, and being introduced to his various girlfriends. And yeah, I'm just going to miss him very much.
Yeah, with Shane, there's always a story or two. He told some himself, that's for sure. I met Shane for the first time when I was still helping out at Brew, the evening service where we served coffee and cake, and I think that's the reason he came. We were doing God at the Movies. I'll never forget, it was probably the first time I saw Shane differently. When we were looking at The Life of Pi, a complicated movie where a boy survives an ordeal at sea on a life raft with a tiger. And the message of the movie is that the tiger wasn't really there, but it was that part of Pi, the main character, that he was learning to control. And I explained to them that the most important part of the story was the fact that we all have this part in us that we have to learn to control. Shane came to me afterwards and he actually said to me, that tiger, I have it living in me, and it's impossible to control. And it's the first time I saw Shane as somebody so much deeper than somebody who'd come for free coffee. He really was absorbing what we were saying and thinking about it. Shane, of course, I knew on the street. Not that I lived on the street, but we dwelled in the same circles, I think on purpose sometimes on his part. And he often used to approach me and ask me for shoes, but I must make sure they're the right size, and he prefers school shoes because they're harder. But he was always injured, stabbed, knocked by a car twice. But once he was quite wounded, I could see it, and he limped over to me and told me that he'd fallen out of a tree stealing avos. And so I told him that it wasn't right to be stealing avos, and he said that it was quite within his rights because the owner just let them fall onto the floor. But up in that avo tree, he lost his balance and he fell out. And just more recently, I saw him with avos again, and I said, have you been stealing avos again? And he said, yes, but from a different tree because it's lower. And we had a proper laugh about it. I mean, that's what I loved about Shane. I mean, a proper laugh about the fact that he was still stealing avos, but more carefully this time. It's such a hoot. Yes, Shane. Just I often saw Shane, especially during lockdown or just after lockdown when he moved. I often saw him on the street up here near Five Ways, and sometimes I was in a rush, and so we would wave and I would avoid him because I just didn't have the time. So one day I saw Shane and he started walking in my direction, and mercifully the robots turned green, and so I waved and drove. And when I looked in my rearview mirror, Shane had broken into a run, and he was surprisingly keeping up with me in the traffic. And I knew that I was going to hit the next red robot as well. And when I was stopped there, I saw Shane had nearly caught up with me, and I started feeling bad that I was avoiding him. And I thought he's probably going to ask for something. And so eventually I pulled off and said, Shane, I see you're desperate to see me. Can I help you? And no, he said, no, I was just trying to say hello. And I felt terrible. I really felt terrible. I mean, we had a long chat. And he told me about his circumstance at the moment, and I felt really bad that I tried to drive away from him that day. And at the end of the conversation, he smiled, that chipped tooth smile that he often smiled, and he said, do you have any money for me? And he conned me. He really conned me, and I loved him for it because that was how Shane was. He lived and survived that way. So I always appreciated it. I gave stuff to Shane very reluctantly. Because especially money, but I liked to help him where I could. If he needed a blanket, I gave him a blanket, but he lost several of them, and so I gave him a jacket one day, one of my favorites, and said to him that he was welcome to the jacket. It was getting cold. At that time he was sleeping in the toilets at Nobeli Street in Newton Park, and I said to him, but Shane, if you lose this jacket, I'll never give you another thing, not another thing. This will be the last thing I ever give you. I saw him a day or two later, and it was one of the hottest days we'd had in a year. He was wearing my thick padded jacket, and he told me the reason he was wearing it is because he dared not put it down in case he lost it. We had a good laugh about that, but I didn't go too close that day, just a little too hot. But Shane, I miss him. The last time I saw Shane, a day or two before I heard that he had been knocked over by a car, he was in Parliament Street. And he was wearing a cowboy hat. And I stopped and teased him about it and said that when I was a kid, I used to watch a TV program called Shane about a cowboy. And he looked like a cowboy. And I said, where's your horse? He didn't find it funny at all. But Shane, that's how he was. You took him as you got him.